They thought silence meant weakness, until the wrong man decided to speak. The wind moved slow through the town that afternoon, carrying dust across the wooden street like a warning no one cared to hear. Storefront signs creaking, horses shifting, boots planted in that familiar half-circle people formed when something didn't sit right, but no one planned to stop it. And at the center stood Naya, her hands held tight behind her, not struggling, not pleading, just standing there with a stillness that didn't belong to fear, but to something deeper, something older than the town itself, her dark eyes scanning faces that refused to meet hers for long. Because it was easier that way. Easier to believe what they'd already decided. Easier to call her a thief than admit they didn't understand her at all. And somewhere to the side, Sheriff Pike adjusted his belt, glancing once at the silver chain in his hand before holding it up just enough for the crowd to see. A small thing, delicate, glinting under the harsh noon sun like it carried more weight than it should, found. In her possession, he said, voice steady. Practiced, like he'd done this before, like he knew how these moments were supposed to end. And the murmurs came quick, low at first, then louder, stacking on top of each other until they became something solid, something final. And Naya said nothing, not because she couldn't, but because she understood something they didn't. That truth didn't always live in words, especially not here. Not in a place where people listened only to what fit the story they needed. And near the edge of the saloon porch, half in shadow, Elias Boone sat unmoving, hat tilted low, a glass untouched in front of him. The kind of man you noticed only when you looked twice, and most folks didn't, because there was nothing loud about him. Nothing demanding attention, just a quiet weight that settled into a room without asking permission. And if you stayed long enough, you'd hear the whispers that he kept to himself, that he didn't speak unless he had to. That trouble seemed to pass him by as if it recognized something it didn't want to test. And even now, as the tension stretched across the street like a wire pulled too tight, Elias didn't move, didn't react, just watched, not the crowd, not the sheriff, but the girl, as if he were measuring something no one else could see. And then it shifted, subtle at first, a man stepping forward from the circle, reaching out like he had a right, like this moment belonged to him. Fingers brushing too close to her shoulder, not harsh, not yet, but enough. Enough to tilt the balance, enough to turn a mistake into something worse. And Naya's gaze flickered just once, not to the sheriff, not to the crowd, but past them, toward the shadow where Elias sat. And for the first time, there was something there. Not fear, not hope, just recognition. Like she knew what silence could cost. And still, he didn't move. Not yet, because some things, out here, had to reach their edge before they could turn back. And the wind slowed. The dust settled, and the town held its breath without knowing why. The man hesitated, just for a second. But in a place like this, a second was enough to be noticed. Enough for the crowd to feel that small crack in what they thought was certain, and Sheriff Pike saw it too. His eyes narrowing not at Naya, but at the shifting line of men who suddenly were not as sure of themselves as they had been moments before. And that was when he cleared his throat, louder this time, stepping forward as if to pull the moment back under control. That chain did not walk into her hands on its own, he said, his voice firm but carrying a hint of something else now. Something thinner. Something that did not quite reach the edges of the street. And he turned slightly, holding the chain higher, letting the sunlight catch it again. But this time it did not shine the same. Not with Elias Boone standing just 20 feet away, watching, not blinking, not speaking, just watching like a man who already knew how this would end. And Naya felt that shift before she understood it. Felt the weight of eyes no longer pressing down on her the same way. And slowly, carefully, she straightened her shoulders, not in defiance, not in challenge, but in something quieter, something steadier. And when she finally spoke, her voice was not loud, but it carried, clear and even across the open space. I did not take it, she said, each word placed like a stone, simple, unadorned. And for a moment no one answered, because the truth, when it arrives without fear, has a way of unsettling people who expect something else. And one of the men near the back shifted his weight, glancing at the ground as if searching for something he had dropped, while another rubbed the back of his neck, eyes flicking between the sheriff and Elias, unsure where to stand. And Sheriff Pike felt it slipping now, not the accusation, but the certainty, and that was the dangerous part, because certainty was what kept order in places like this, even when it was built on the wrong thing. And he stepped closer to Naya, lowering his voice just enough that it forced the crowd to lean in. "Then explain how it came to you," he said, and there it was, the moment that could bend either way, the kind that decided stories before they were ever told. And Naya looked at him, not with anger, not with fear, but with something older, something that did not belong to this street or this town. And she shook her head once, slowly. "It was given," she said, and that word hung there, heavier than any accusation, because given meant trust, and trust was not something this town believed she deserved. And the murmurs started again, softer now, more uncertain, and through it all, Elias Boone took one step forward, just one, boots pressing into the dust with a quiet sound that somehow carried farther than any shout, and every head turned again, not because he demanded it, but because something about him made people listen before they understood why. And Sheriff Pike watched him carefully now, measuring, calculating, because men like Elias were not dangerous for what they did, but for what they chose not to do until it mattered most. And the chain in his hand suddenly felt heavier than before, like it did not belong to him at all. And Elias stopped, close enough now that the distance between them felt smaller than it was, his gaze moving from the sheriff to the chain, and then to Naya. And there was something in that look, something that did not accuse, did not defend, but recognized. And for the first time since she had been pulled into that street, Naya did not feel alone. And that was the moment everything truly began to change. The chain rested in Sheriff Pike's hand, but it no longer felt like evidence. It felt like a question, and questions were harder to control than accusations, especially when a man like Elias Boone was standing close enough to hear the answer, and Pike knew it, even if he would never say it out loud. And he shifted his grip slightly, as if the small piece of silver might offer him some kind of certainty if he held it tight enough. But it did not. It only reflected the sun and the faces around him, faces that were no longer as firm as they had been minutes ago. And that was when a voice broke from the edge of the crowd, hesitant, uncertain. "I saw something," the man said, not stepping forward yet, just enough for the words to reach the center. And the air changed again, quieter now, sharper, like the moment before a storm chooses where to land. And Pike turned his head slowly, eyes locking onto the speaker, a ranch hand most people barely noticed, the kind of man who kept his head down and his opinions quieter still. And for a second, it looked like he might take the words back, might disappear into the crowd again like he had never spoken at all. But then Elias shifted his weight, just a fraction, not toward the man, not toward the sheriff, just enough that it was seen, and somehow that was enough, enough to hold the moment in place, enough to keep it from slipping away. And the ranch hand swallowed hard before continuing. "It was not her," he said, voice steadier now. "I saw the chain this morning, over by the well, hanging off the post where folks tie their horses. It must have fallen." And the words landed one at a time, simple, clear, impossible to twist without breaking them completely. And the murmurs that followed were different this time, not loud, not certain, but searching, like the crowd was trying to rebuild a story that no longer fit together the way it had before. And Sheriff Pike felt it, felt the shift slipping further from his hands, and he looked back at the chain again, really looked at it this time, at the worn clasp, the faint markings along the edge that spoke of age and care, not theft, not haste. And then he looked at Naya, standing there without moving, without begging, and something in that stillness unsettled him more than any argument could have, because it did not match the picture he had been given. And across from him, Elias Boone finally moved again, one slow step closer, close enough now that the distance between them carried weight, not threat, just presence. And when he spoke, his voice was low, even, carrying without effort. "You know what it is," he said, not asking, not accusing, just stating something that had been waiting to be acknowledged. And Pike's jaw tightened slightly, because he did know, or at least he knew enough to understand that this was no longer about a missing chain. It was about what kind of man he would be in front of this town. And that was a harder thing to hold on to than any piece of evidence. And the silence that followed stretched longer than any before it, because now it was not fear holding it in place, it was choice, and everyone felt it, even those who did not understand it. And Naya stood at the center of it all, no longer just a figure in someone else's story, but something else entirely, something the town had not expected, and the truth, quiet and steady, waited to see who would finally speak it out loud. The silence did not break all at once. It thinned, like ice under slow weight, and Sheriff Pike felt it give beneath him in ways no badge could steady, his fingers loosening around the chain before he even realized it, the metal slipping just slightly in his grip as if it no longer recognized his authority. And for a long second, he said nothing, because saying nothing was easier than choosing wrong in front of a town that was watching closer now than it ever had. And Elias Boone did not move, did not press, did not demand. He simply stood there with that same quiet certainty, the kind that did not need witnesses to be true. And that was what made it heavier than anything Pike could argue against, because it was not force, it was presence. And presence had a way of stripping things down to what they really were. And when Pike finally spoke, his voice came slower than before, less certain. If it was left at the well, he began, but the sentence did not finish the way he intended. It drifted, because the conclusion had already arrived without him, and the ranch hand shifted again, stepping forward this time, boots pressing into the dust like he had made a decision he could not take back. "I saw her pick it up," he said, nodding toward Naya. She looked around like she was trying to find who it belonged to. And that detail, small and ordinary, landed harder than any defense could have, because it carried no weight of argument, just simple truth, and the crowd felt it. The kind of truth that did not ask for belief, only recognition, and one by one, shoulders eased, eyes dropped. The certainty that had filled the street began to drain away, leaving something quieter in its place, something closer to doubt, and Pike exhaled slowly, the sound barely noticeable, but it carried the shift of a man stepping back from something he could no longer hold. And he lowered the chain, no longer displaying it, no longer presenting it as proof, just holding it as what it was, an object, nothing more. And for the first time, he looked directly at Naya, without the weight of accusation behind his eyes. And what he saw there did not match the story he had accepted so easily, and that realization settled in deeper than he expected, because it meant the mistake had been his to carry, not hers to answer for. And across from him, Elias gave the smallest nod, not approval, not victory, just acknowledgement, like a man recognizing that something had been set back where it belonged. And it was enough to release the tension that had held the street tight, enough to let the moment breathe again. And Naya slowly brought her hands forward, no one stopping her now, no one reaching to hold her back, because the need for that had quietly disappeared. And she looked at the chain in Pike's hand, then at Elias. And there was a question there, not spoken, not pressed, just present. And Elias stepped forward one last time, closing the space between them, reaching out not to take the chain, but to turn it gently in Pike's hand, revealing the small markings along its edge, worn but clear if you knew what to look for. And Pike's eyes followed the movement, narrowing slightly as recognition settled in, not sudden, but steady, like something remembered from a long time ago. And Elias spoke again, softer now, but carrying just as far. "It was never lost," he said, just waiting for the right hands to return it. And that was when Pike finally understood, not just the chain, not just the moment, but the weight of what had almost happened. And he extended his hand, offering it not back to the crowd, not to himself, but to Naya. And the gesture, simple as it was, carried more than any apology could have, because it admitted something without needing to say it. And Naya accepted it without hesitation, her fingers closing around the silver as if it had always belonged there. And for a brief moment, the entire town stood still again. But this time it was different, not held by fear or tension, but by the quiet realization that something had changed, something they could not quite name. And as Elias turned away, already stepping back into the shadow he had come from, no one stopped him, no one called after him, because some men did not need to stay to be understood, and some truths did not need to be spoken twice. The town did not return to normal, not right away, because moments like that do not disappear. They settle, they linger in the spaces between words and glances. And as Elias Boone stepped back toward the shade of the saloon porch, it felt less like a man leaving and more like something quiet being restored to its place. And no one tried to stop him, not because they could not, but because they understood, in a way they had not before, that he had never been part of what they almost allowed to happen. He had only been the line that kept it from going further, and Sheriff Pike remained where he stood, his hand lowering slowly after releasing the chain, his shoulders carrying a weight that had nothing to do with authority anymore. And he glanced once at the ranch hand who had spoken, then at the crowd, as if measuring something that no longer added up the same way. And he gave a small nod, not to anyone in particular, just to the moment itself, before stepping back, creating space where there had been none. And that was when people began to move, not all at once, not with purpose, but gradually, like a tide pulling away, conversations starting in low tones, boots turning, hats tipping, eyes avoiding the center where Naya still stood, now holding the chain that had nearly become something else entirely. And she did not rush to leave, did not hurry to disappear the way many expected she would. Instead, she stood there for a moment longer, feeling the weight of the metal in her palm, the faint warmth left by the sun, and something deeper beneath it, something tied to a story she had not been told but somehow understood. And when she finally moved, it was not away from the town, but toward the edge of the porch where Elias had returned. Though he had not sat down again, he stood with his back to the post, hat still low, as if the moment had not changed him at all, as if he had simply stepped in and out of something that did not belong to him. And when Naya stopped a few feet away, she did not speak right away, because she knew better than to fill silence that was meant to hold meaning. And for a few seconds, they stood like that, the noise of the town drifting back and around them, distant, unimportant. And then she opened her hand, letting the chain rest in her palm where he could see it clearly. "You knew," she said quietly, not a question, not an accusation, just an acknowledgement. And Elias lifted his gaze slightly, just enough that his eyes met hers beneath the brim, and there was no pride there, no claim to what had happened, just a simple truth. "I recognized it," he replied, his voice as calm as it had been before, as if the words carried no more weight than the wind moving through the street. And Naya studied him for a moment longer, as if searching for something behind the words, something that explained not just the chain, but him. And she turned the silver once between her fingers, tracing the worn markings along its edge. "Your mother," she said, and it was not a guess, not entirely, more like something that had been placed into her understanding without needing explanation. And Elias gave a slight nod, the smallest confirmation, and for a brief moment, the space between them held something unspoken, something that did not belong to this town or its rules, something older, quieter. And then he looked away, not dismissing her, but releasing the moment before it could become something else. And he reached for his glass, finally lifting it, though he did not drink, just holding it there as if grounding himself back into the simple things that did not ask questions. And Naya closed her hand around the chain once more, understanding that whatever had passed between them was not meant to be carried further in words. And as she turned to leave, stepping back into the open street that now felt different beneath her feet, she realized that what had changed was not just how the town saw her, but how it would remember this day. Because out here, stories did not need to be told twice. They settled into the dust and waited, and sometimes, all it took was one man choosing to speak for the truth to find its place again. The sun had begun to lean west by the time the street fully loosened its grip on what had happened, shadows stretching longer across the wooden planks, softening edges that had felt sharp just an hour before. And yet the change was not in the light. It was in the way people moved through it, slower, quieter, like each step carried a thought they had not expected to have that day. And Sheriff Pike remained near the center a moment longer than the others, his gaze drifting across the storefronts, the faces, the empty space where certainty had once stood. And he adjusted his hat, not out of habit this time, but as if trying to settle something inside himself that would not quite sit right. And then he turned and walked back toward his office without a word, leaving behind a silence that no one tried to fill. And near the well, the ranch hand who had spoken earlier lingered with his hands resting on the post, staring at the spot where he claimed the chain had hung, as if replaying the moment in his mind to be sure it had happened the way he remembered. And across the street, a pair of men who had once spoken loudest now kept their voices low, their words shorter, glancing occasionally toward the saloon porch before looking away again. Because something about that quiet figure had unsettled more than just a single accusation. It had unsettled the way they understood themselves. And Elias Boone stood where he had been, glass still in hand, not drinking, not watching anyone in particular, just present in that steady way that made time feel slower around him. And for a while, nothing happened, not the kind of nothing that feels empty, but the kind that holds weight, like the land itself was considering what had passed before deciding how to carry it forward. And then, from the far edge of the street, Naya reappeared, not hurried, not cautious, simply walking with the same quiet confidence she had held before, the chain now resting against her palm. The silver catching the lower light in softer tones, and a few heads turned as she crossed the open space again, not with suspicion this time, but with something closer to curiosity, maybe even respect, though no one said it out loud. And she stopped near the well, the same place where the story had begun to unravel, and for a moment she looked at the wooden post, at the worn grooves where countless reins had been tied over the years, and she reached out, placing the chain there, letting it hang just as it had been described, not as evidence, not as a test, but as a quiet gesture, as if returning the moment to where it should have been understood the first time. And then she stepped back, not waiting to see who would notice, because some things did not need an audience to be complete. And from the porch, Elias watched that single movement, the faintest shift in his posture marking that he had seen it, that he understood what it meant, and after a few seconds, he set his glass down on the railing without a sound, turning away from the street as he began to walk, not toward the center, not toward anyone, just away, boots steady against the wood, each step carrying him back into the quiet. That had always been his place, and no one stopped him, not even Naya, because she knew that whatever had passed between them was not meant to be followed. It was meant to be remembered, and as the light faded a little more and the town slowly returned to its rhythms, something remained, something unspoken but understood, that out here, truth did not belong to the loudest voice. It belonged to the one who chose the right moment to speak. And sometimes, that was enough to change everything. Without leaving a mark anyone could see, evening settled over the town with a kind of quiet that did not belong to peace, but to reflection, the kind that comes after something almost goes wrong and everyone knows it, even if no one says it out loud. And the light stretched long across the ground, turning dust into gold and shadows into something softer, and near the well, the chain still hung where Naya had placed it, untouched, unnoticed by some, but not by all, because a few passed by slower than they needed to, glancing at it as if it might speak if they looked long enough. And the ranch hand who had spoken earlier returned there again, standing just a few feet away, arms crossed now, not out of defense, but out of thought, replaying not just what he had seen, but what he had nearly allowed by staying silent too long. And across the street, Sheriff Pike paused at his doorway before stepping inside, his hand resting briefly on the frame, his eyes drifting once more toward the chain, then toward the empty porch where Elias had stood, and something in his expression shifted, not regret exactly, but awareness, the kind that lingers longer than pride. And then he disappeared inside, the door closing without sound, leaving the street to its quiet. And further down, Naya walked slowly past the last row of buildings, not leaving, not yet, just moving through the town as if seeing it for what it was for the first time, not a place of danger, not a place of safety, just a place where people made choices, and sometimes those choices changed everything. And she stopped near the edge where the dirt road opened wide into the land beyond, the horizon stretching far, untouched, honest in a way the town had struggled to be. And she turned once more, looking back, not searching for faces, not expecting anything, just holding the moment in her mind. And from the far side of the saloon, Elias Boone reappeared, not calling out, not approaching, just stepping into the open long enough to be seen, his figure outlined by the fading light. And for a second, their eyes met across the distance, not as strangers, not as allies, but as two people who had stood on opposite sides of something, and understood what it meant to step through it. And he gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible, but enough to acknowledge what had passed without claiming it. And then he turned, walking away from the street entirely, toward the open land behind the buildings, where the noise could not follow and the stories could not reach him. And Naya watched him go, not with curiosity, not with questions, but with a quiet certainty that some people were not meant to stay, they were meant to appear exactly when needed and leave before they became something else. And she turned as well, stepping onto the road that led away from the town, the chain no longer in her hand, but hanging where it belonged, and behind her, the town remained, quieter now, changed in ways that would not be spoken but would be remembered, because out here, people did not always learn from words. They learned from moments, from the weight of silence, from the sound of one voice choosing the right time to break it. And as the last light faded, the wind picked up again, carrying dust across the street, brushing over the chain, the footprints, the place where it had all shifted, as if the land itself was closing the story, not to erase it, but to keep it exactly where it needed to be. Morning did not rush into the town the next day. It arrived slowly, like it was careful not to disturb what had settled overnight. Light creeping across rooftops, slipping between wooden slats, touching the dust in thin, pale lines that revealed more than they hid. And the street looked the same at first glance. Same buildings, same worn paths, same quiet rhythm beginning to return, but there was something different in the way people stepped out of their doors, something measured, something that lingered in their eyes before they spoke. And near the well, the chain still hung where it had been left, untouched through the night. The silver dulled slightly by the cool air, but steady, waiting, and the first man to approach it did not reach for it right away. He stood there, hands on his hips, staring at it like it held a memory he was not sure he wanted to face. And after a few seconds, he turned and walked away. Without a word, leaving it exactly where it was, and one by one, others passed by, some slowing, some pretending not to notice, but all aware of it in a way they had not been the day before, because now it was not just an object, it was a reminder, and reminders have a way of settling deeper than facts. And Sheriff Pike stepped out of his office a little later than usual, his movements slower, less certain, and when his eyes found the chain, he did not look away this time. He walked toward it, each step deliberate, not because anyone was watching, but because he understood that this moment was not for the town, it was for himself. And when he reached the post, he stood there quietly, looking at the worn markings along the edge, tracing them with his eyes as if learning something he should have known before. And after a long second, he reached out, not to take it, but to adjust it slightly, letting it hang more evenly, as if restoring it to its rightful place was the only thing left he could do. And then he stepped back, leaving it there, choosing not to carry it away, choosing instead to let it remain where truth had first been overlooked. And across the street, the ranch hand watched this from a distance, arms no longer crossed, posture easier now, as if a weight he had carried quietly had been shared, and the town moved around them, slower still, but steadier, like something fragile had been set down carefully and no one wanted to disturb it again. And out beyond the buildings, where the land stretched open and the road bent toward the horizon, a lone figure moved through the early light, not looking back, not pausing, just walking with the same quiet certainty that had carried him through the day before. And though no one called his name, no one followed, his presence lingered in the town in a way that could not be undone, not because of what he had said, but because of when he had said it. And near the edge of the street, Naya stood once more, watching from a distance, not stepping forward this time, not returning to the center, just observing, as if she understood that some stories were not meant to be held onto, only understood. And when she turned to leave again, there was no hesitation in her step, no weight left behind, because what needed to be seen had been seen, what needed to be spoken had been spoken, and what remained was something quieter, something that would stay in the town long after the dust settled again, a reminder that truth does not always arrive loud, but when it does arrive, it changes the ground beneath every step that follows. By midday, the town had settled into something that looked like routine, but it was not the same routine as before. It was quieter in the spaces that used to be loud, more careful in the places where certainty had once come too easily, and the chain still hung at the well, not as something forgotten, but as something intentionally left behind, a small piece of silver holding more weight than any sign or badge in the street. And people had begun to treat it that way, not touching it, not claiming it, just letting it remain where it reminded them what had nearly been decided too quickly. And Sheriff Pike stepped out again, this time earlier, his movements more deliberate than they had been in years, and he paused by the well without hesitation, not looking around to see who noticed, because this was no longer about being seen, and he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small cloth, worn and folded, and without a word he gently wiped the dust from the chain, not polishing it, not making it shine, just clearing what did not belong. And when he was done, he stepped back again, leaving it as it was meant to be, simple, visible, honest, and a few people nearby watched this without speaking, because they understood what it meant when a man chose to correct something quietly instead of defending it loudly. And across the street, the ranch hand leaned against the post, no longer uneasy, no longer uncertain, just present, as if he had found his place in a story he had almost missed. And the day moved on. Horses came and went, doors opened and closed, voices rose and fell. But there was a difference now, a pause before judgment, a moment of thought where there had been none. And out on the edge of town, Naya had not gone far. She had stopped where the road bent slightly, where the town was still visible but distant enough to feel separate. And she stood there for a while, watching the movement, not searching for anything, just observing, as if measuring whether the change she felt was real or only temporary. And after some time, she turned back again, not because she needed to, but because something unfinished lingered, something that had not been spoken. And when she returned to the street, her presence did not stop conversation this time. It did not draw the same sharp attention. It simply shifted the air slightly, enough to be noticed but not resisted. And she walked to the well, standing beside the chain, looking at it not as an object, but as a moment captured in place. And for a second, she reached out, touching it lightly, not to take it, just to feel its weight again. And then she let it fall back against the post, exactly where it had been. And from the far end of the street, a young boy approached slowly, stopping a few feet away, staring at her with the kind of open curiosity that had not yet learned fear. And after a moment, he spoke, simple and direct. "Is it yours?" And Naya looked at him, then at the chain, and she shook her head gently. "No," she said. "It belongs to the truth." And the boy frowned slightly, not fully understanding, but sensing that the answer mattered, and he nodded anyway, as children do when something feels important even if it is not clear. And he turned and ran back toward his home, carrying that small piece of understanding with him. And as Naya stepped away once more, she glanced briefly toward the open land beyond the buildings, where a single figure had already disappeared beyond sight. And though he was gone, what he had left behind remained, not in words, not in memory alone, but in the way the town now paused before speaking, in the way a simple chain could change how people saw one another, and in the quiet understanding that sometimes the right voice at the right moment does not just stop a wrong, it reshapes everything that comes after. The afternoon carried on, but the town no longer moved the way it used to, not with that quick certainty, not with that easy judgment that had once filled every corner like dust in the wind. And the chain at the well had become something else entirely, not an object to be claimed, not something to be questioned, but a quiet marker, a line drawn without words that reminded anyone who passed it that truth did not belong to whoever spoke first. And Sheriff Pike found himself returning to it more than once that day, not out of duty, but out of something closer to responsibility, as if standing near it helped him understand the weight of what had almost happened. And each time he paused there, he said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that would matter more than what had already been done. And across the street, the men who once filled the air with loud opinions now chose their words more carefully, glancing toward one another before speaking, as if waiting for permission. That no longer came as easily as before, and the ranch hand moved through the town with a different posture now, not proud, not seeking attention, just steady, like a man who had found the right moment and chosen it well. And people noticed, not openly, but in the way they nodded when he passed, in the way they gave him space without needing to explain why. And near the edge of the buildings, Naya stood once more, not as an outsider, not as someone under watch, but simply as herself, her presence no longer tightening the air around her. And she watched the town with a calm that came from understanding something the others were only beginning to see, that change does not arrive with noise. It settles quietly and reshapes what comes after. And she stepped toward the well again, stopping just short of the post, her eyes resting on the chain that had become more than silver in time. And she did not reach for it this time. She did not touch it at all, because she knew it did not belong in her hand. It belonged where it could be seen, where it could remind, and from somewhere behind her, a voice called out, not loud, not commanding, just clear, Sheriff Pike, asking if she would remain in town a while longer, and the question carried something new, not suspicion, not authority, but respect, quiet and unspoken, and she turned slightly, meeting his gaze without hesitation, and after a moment, she nodded once, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement, because staying or leaving was no longer about escape. It was about choice, and Pike understood that, even if he could not fully explain it, and he stepped back, giving her that space without needing to say more, and the wind moved again through the street, lifting dust in soft spirals that caught the light before settling once more, brushing past the chain, past the footprints, past the place where everything had shifted, and out beyond the town, far past where the buildings gave way to open land. A single figure walked along the ridge, small against the wide horizon, never looking back, because some men do not stay to see what they change. They trust that what needed to take root already has, and in the town behind him, that truth held steady, not in words, not in stories told over drinks, but in the quiet pause before judgment, in the way hands no longer reached without thought, and in the understanding that sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is speak only once, and let the silence that follows carry the rest. The day stretched longer than it used to, not because the sun moved slower, but because people did, each moment carrying a weight they had not noticed before, and the town had begun to learn something without speaking it, something that settled in the way doors were opened with a pause, in the way eyes met and held just a second longer before turning away, and near the well, the chain remained, untouched but not ignored, its presence now woven into the rhythm of the street like it had always been there, and Sheriff Pike found himself standing beside it again, not out of habit, but out of understanding, his hands resting at his sides, his gaze steady, and when a traveler approached asking for water, Pike stepped aside without a word, letting the man tie his horse to the post without brushing the chain aside, because now even small movements carried meaning, and the traveler glanced at it, curious, but did not ask, sensing something in the air that told him this was not his story to question, and across the street, the ranch hand spoke quietly with another man, his voice low but clear, explaining what he had seen not to convince, but to remember it right, because truth needed to be kept straight even after it was accepted, and the other man listened without interrupting, nodding slowly, not because he had doubted before, but because hearing it again made it settle deeper, and Naya moved through the town once more, not watched now, not followed, simply present, and she paused near the edge of the porch where Elias had once stood, her fingers brushing lightly against the worn wood as if it held an echo of something that had already passed, and she looked out across the street, not searching for him, because she knew he would not return, but understanding that his absence did not erase what he had left behind, and Sheriff Pike stepped forward then, not with authority, but with something quieter, stopping a few feet from her, his voice measured. "The town will remember," he said, not as a promise, not as an excuse, just as a statement of what he hoped would be true, and Naya looked at him, her expression calm, her eyes steady, and after a moment, she nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement that memory was not something a man could guarantee. It was something people had to choose again and again, and Pike understood that too, even if it sat heavy on him, and he turned slightly, looking back at the well, at the chain, at the place where everything had nearly gone wrong. And he spoke again, softer this time. "I almost did not see it." And the words were simple, but they carried more than any defense ever could, and Naya did not answer right away, because some truths do not need response. They need to be held. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but certain. "You saw it when it mattered. And that was enough. Enough to leave the past where it belonged without ignoring it. Enough to let the moment stand without breaking it apart." And Pike exhaled slowly, the tension easing from his shoulders not completely, but enough, and he stepped back again, giving her the space that had once been taken too quickly, and as the sun began to dip lower once more, casting long shadows across the street, The town continued its slow adjustment, not dramatic, not loud, but real, and out beyond the buildings, the land stretched wide and unchanged, holding the same quiet truth it always had, that people come and go, that stories rise and settle, but what remains is what is carried forward. And in that town, in that moment, something had been carried differently, something that would shape the next choice, and the one after that, not because someone told them to, but because they had felt what it meant to almost be wrong, and to be stopped by a voice that chose its moment well. The sun dipped lower than it had the day before, and this time the town noticed it, not because the light was different, but because they were, and the shadows stretched longer across the street, touching the well, the post, the chain that still hung there, steady and quiet, no longer questioned, no longer claimed, just present in a way that had become part of everything around it. And people had begun to move with that awareness woven into them, not as a burden, but as something learned, something earned. And Sheriff Pike stood at his doorway again, not watching for trouble, not scanning for wrong, but simply observing, as if trying to understand what it meant to carry authority without letting it outrun truth. And he saw it in small things, in the way a man paused before speaking, in the way another stepped back to let someone else pass, in the way no one reached for the chain without reason. And those small things mattered more now than anything loud ever had. And across the street, the ranch hand leaned against the same post as before, but there was no tension left in him, no hesitation, just a quiet steadiness, like he had found the right place to stand and no longer needed to question it. And Naya walked through the center of the town one more time, not because she needed to, but because this place, for all its flaws, had become part of something she understood now. And as she passed the well, she slowed just slightly, her eyes resting on the chain, and for a moment, she saw not the silver, not the markings, but the moment itself, the shift, the choice, the voice that had changed its course. And she did not reach for it, because she knew it was not meant to be taken. It was meant to remain, to remind. And a few steps beyond, a woman standing near a storefront glanced at her, then offered the smallest nod, not formal, not forced, just genuine. And Naya returned it just as simply, because respect does not need words when it is understood. And the moment passed without ceremony, but it lingered in the air like something new taking root. And Sheriff Pike stepped forward then, walking slowly to the well, standing beside it not as a man correcting a mistake, but as one who had already learned from it. And he looked at the chain one last time before turning his gaze toward the open road, and in that direction, far beyond the reach of the town, a single figure had once walked without looking back, leaving behind no claim, no demand, just a moment that had reshaped everything. And Pike understood now that some men do not stay, because their work is not to belong. It is to remind others what belonging should look like. And he placed his hand lightly against the post, not holding it, just feeling the worn wood beneath his palm, grounding himself in something real, something steady. And then he stepped away, leaving the chain where it was, because it did not need guarding. It needed remembering. And as the last light of the day settled across the town, soft and quiet, the street held that understanding in every step, every glance, every silence. And out beyond it all, the land stretched wide and unchanged, carrying the same truth it always had, that what matters is not how loud a man speaks, but whether he speaks when it matters most. And in that town, in that moment, that truth had found its place, not in words, but in the way everything moved afterward. The night came gently, the kind that settles without asking, wrapping the town in a quiet that no longer felt uncertain, but earned. And the last light faded from the edges of the buildings, leaving only lantern glow and the soft outline of the street where everything had shifted days before. And still, the chain remained at the well, catching what little light there was, not shining, not calling attention, just present. The way truth often is when it has nothing left to prove, and people passed it without touching it, not out of fear, but out of understanding, because it no longer belonged to anyone's hand. It belonged to the moment that had changed them. And Sheriff Pike stepped out one final time before closing his office for the night, his boots slow against the wood, his gaze steady as it moved to the post. And he paused there, not out of habit, but out of respect, Because some places become more than places when something real happens there. And he stood for a moment, longer than necessary, not thinking of what he had done wrong, but of what he would do differently the next time. Because that is where change truly lives, not in regret, but in the next choice. And across the street, the ranch hand leaned back against the wall, arms relaxed now, his eyes no longer searching for approval, just steady, because he had already chosen once, and that was enough to carry him forward. And the town moved quieter now, not because it had lost its voice, but because it had learned when not to use it. And near the edge of the street, Naya stood one last time, her silhouette still against the dim light, not waiting, not watching, just present in a way that felt complete. And she looked toward the well, toward the chain, and there was no weight in her expression now, no question left unanswered, because what needed to be seen had been seen, what needed to be corrected had been corrected, and what remained was not hers to carry, it belonged to the town. And she turned slowly, stepping toward the open road once more, her path clear, her pace steady. And this time, she did not look back, not because she was leaving something behind, but because there was nothing left unfinished, and far beyond the reach of the lantern light, the land stretched wide and quiet, holding the same truth it always had, that a man is not measured by how often he speaks, but by whether he speaks when it matters. And somewhere out there, beyond the ridge, a quiet man had already moved on, leaving no name behind, no claim, just a moment that would live longer than any story told about it. And in the town, in the silence that followed, people carried that moment forward in small ways, in pauses, in choices, in the space they gave before deciding. And no one said it out loud, but they all felt it, that something had changed, not loudly, not suddenly, but permanently. Because out here, justice does not need to be declared, it only needs to be recognized. And once it is, it stays, like a chain left hanging in the right place, like a voice that spoke only once and was heard long after it was gone.